Good evening, boys and girls, and welcome back to another story time. Tonight we're reading off another subreddit of nosleep. Let's dive right on in. My friend told me about an explosion in the woods just outside his house. He lives a few miles outside of town, not exactly in a cabin or even on a farm, but within some crossbreed of those things. A home fully encircled by a range of trees. More a grove than a fully fledged forest, an environment that is rural enough to be a break for those of us who'd like a break from the dullness of ever-expanding suburbia. An explosion of any nature, provided that it's not nuclear and fast approaching, would draw the interest of anyone. As soon as I got the text, I put on my best "oh, I don't feel so good" performance, and was, of course, excused from work, being a pharmacy technician in the highly frequented pharmacy of a grocery store. I drove to my friend's house, who was waiting for me on his front porch, flashlights in hand. It was growing dark, with only the dwindling orange wake of the sun's departure left in the sky. We trekked through the underbrush, tripping over vines and bushes, and tripping each other, when the opportunities for mischief arose. Along the way, he explained that he'd heard the explosion while he was in his basement, had felt the earth above and below violently tremble. When he went outside, he saw only a thin layer of smoke and dust. No great fireball, no spreading conflagration, so he assumed it was safe to investigate. Then, knowing I'd want to come along, he texted me. The site of the explosion wasn't far away from his house, maybe half a mile. The nearby trees were blasted to ruins. The grass of the area was incinerated. The air charged with some kind of residual static or visually undetectable emission. A crater the size of a house sat in the middle of the destruction, several meters deep and blackened by whatever had caused the detonation or impact. Weirdly, despite how thick, with something, the air felt, it wasn't hot. The general atmosphere hadn't been heated by the environmental violence. My friend, for privacy's sake, let's call him Oscar, tentatively touched the scorched ground around the crater and reported that it wasn't too hot, that we could walk on it without fear of burning our shoes. Without further investigation or caution, he slid into the depression and began rummaging around in the debris. With a little more caution, I joined him and confirmed that the ground was indeed only warm. Not at all the heat-blasted earth you'd expect to find in such a newly craterous place. For a few minutes we probed around, but found nothing that gave us any idea about what exactly happened. Disappointed, we clambered back up the curved wall of the crater, mantled the rim, and sat along it. I speculated that rather than something having detonated, some object had fallen from space and disintegrated upon impact. Oscar countered that though it was equally likely, there should still be some remnant, no matter how small, of the celestial object. Neither of us could claim to be even better amateur geologists, physicists, or astronomers, so the details of our observations were limited, our conjectures rudimentary. When night and its accompanying cold arrived, we decided to go back to his house and report the incident to the authorities, since they apparently hadn't become aware of it, based on the fact that no one had come to investigate in the 30 or so minutes we'd spent hanging around the area. Back at Oscar's house, we decided to do what we usually did together, attempt to communicate with the other side. Oscar is what you'd call a dude with a slightly morbid but mostly just entertaining hobby, but Oscar calls himself a novice occultist. In the 3 years I've known him, he's amateurishly dabbled in all manner of the occult and supernatural practices, activities, and studies. Nothing illegal or even morally questionable. He's not evil-hearted or even carelessly curious, but it's an area of interest he's extremely passionate about and engages in almost nightly. Being a fan of horror media, I'd usually play the part of his assistant, at least in the preparation of whatever seance or investigation he happened to have planned. Rarely did I conduct, with equal standing, the rituals and ceremonies myself. Not out of a fear for any negative spiritual repercussions, but because the often absurd rituals typically required the memorization of incantations invocative gestures and postures and other learned demonstrations that I just didn't have the time or care to memorize and perform. And as you might have expected, we never made any actual provable contact with entities beyond the grave, or beings outside the mundane sphere of existence. Not once did we call forth from physically inaccessible vaults of time and space entities of different biological order. The black gulfs between worlds were not traversed at our beckon by alien life forms or inert forms of light and energy. But it was fun to echo his wild calls and mimic his silly gestures in the dead of night, and we usually watched some movie or played some games afterward, where people were far more successful, to their benefit or detriment, in summoning the aforementioned things. I suppose Oscar was a bit bummed out by the harmlessness of the crater, because he suggested, or rather passionately insisted, that we delve deeper, that we put aside the usual frivolities of his hobby and instead cast our nets into the outermost recesses, but not of the universe or some abstractly defined dimension. Oscar wanted to invite into his video game memorabilia-filled basement the unthought of forces that had yet to exist, had yet to be created by some higher being or forged by the fundamental particles of the universe. He explained it like so. The reason we haven't heard from anyone, the reason why no one answers our hails, is because they've already been in contact with humans. Anyone willing to talk to our species is already doing so as we speak, with those who called out to them years, decades before. Why would anyone want to talk to us specifically, two random guys? We're old news. The beings out there know that there's nothing of value they could learn from us, nothing we know that people better equipped and more knowledgeable than us couldn't tell them. So instead of wasting our time searching for something within this realm, let's move even further beyond. Let's try to contact someone, something in the formless domain of the uncreated. When night was firmly settled, we cleared the space in front of his TV of the various game cases and snack wrappers that littered it, and sat on the harshly threaded rug he'd gotten from some pawn shop months ago. I expected him to get out and arrange his collection of candles and censers, but the only paraphernalia he brought out was a mechanical pocket watch. It was old, clearly an antique, the casing slightly tarnished and the glass faded, with the inner accumulation of dust. The clock hands, despite the timepiece's age, seemed in working order. There's someone out there, an entity living on the border of this universe, who calls himself the Black Horologist. He is not who we'll be contacting, but we'll be tapping into his power, an ability he possesses. He is a gardener of outer time, able to nurture, cultivate, or halt its passage. I've read about him and his agents, and while they're all dangerously sinister, I believe we can access his power without them becoming aware of us, similar to holding on to a moving vehicle while you skateboard. The driver wouldn't be aware of you unless they happened to look in the mirror. I nodded, understanding the analogy, though the mechanics of how exactly we'd access this power, considering our previous unfaltering incapacity to make contact with even the most basic spirits. Using this pocket watch, which has been, in a word, sanctified by the Black Horologist, I will temporarily become an anointed horologist, a servant of the Black Horologist. Once having that status, I will project myself forward in time until I outspace even the ultra-elemental phenomenon, and reach the domain of the uncreated, who, by virtue of their non-existence, know all that was, is, and will be. I will converse with them and learn of all things, and then I will recall my spirit to my body and share the unreal knowledge with you. Together, we will finally be acclaimed investigators of not just the paranormal, but of the paratemporal as well. My responses to these grand and cosmically dramatic proclamations were sufficient enough to amicably goad him along, without seeming mocking or insincere. I had absolutely no belief in the plausibility of his latest conjecture, and assumed that the pocket watch had been his grandfather's, from whom he'd inherited the house, and that the Black Horologist might have even been a reference to the old man himself. Still, Still, I was excited, if only to see a new performance from Oscar, who has always utilized the full extent of his theater kid upbringing. I hadn't anticipated just how he planned to use the pocket watch. With a face that once became firmly set, almost grim, Oscar withdrew a hunting knife from his waistband and plunged the blade into his chest, peeled back a layer of glistening flesh, and jammed the pocket watch into the bodily opening. He did this quickly, smoothly, without even a facial twitch to denote the agony he must have assuredly felt. It happened too quickly for me to interrupt it. The transition from excited rambling to austere self-mutilation was bizarrely seamless. Sitting on the rug, back perfectly straight, legs crossed before him, Oscar then closed his eyes and grew stiller than any of the inanimate objects around us. He assumed a state of absolute immobility that I somehow sensed was consistent even down to the cellular levels. An atomic stillness that, as if he had simply blinked into another dimension, leaving only an after-image of himself in our realm. Even the blood from the still gaping chest wound had stopped flowing. A frozen river of crimson trailed down his green t-shirt like some gruesome red brick road that had tapered off into a sprawling forest. A moment later, I heard a loud ticking, as if there were many, or even just a few, massive clocks behind the walls around us. The ticking was unpleasantly audible, an ominous countdown to some unknown yet unpleasant event. It was only after I shut my eyes and my ears honed in on the source that I realized the sounds were coming from Oscar's chest. His face was still frozen, as was the rest of his body, and yet the mechanical tick of slowly rotating clock hands echoed from out of his chest. I stared, horrified, at the gruesome image of my self-mutilated friend, unsure what to do. A part of me wanted to reach into the wound and pull out the pocket watch to hopefully silence the dreadful, maddening ticking. Another part of me, one I'm fairly embarrassed of, wanted me to leave, to flee my friend's house lest I be taken by whatever spirit, presence, or sudden affliction of insanity had possessed him. But despite the potency of the latter cowardly urge, I stayed. But before I could think of anything else to do, my attention was drawn from my friend's still body into the sole basement window, which looked upon the backyard at ground level. The moonlight shone down heavily upon the yard, illuminating the overgrown grass that my friend had neglected since inheriting the house. But between the thick blades and petals, I saw something that dropped my jaw and sent a paralyzing, pervasive chill through my spine. I saw the woods in the distance reform. Trees that had been felled in the earlier meteoric impact were re-erected, as if pulled upright by some inverse gravitational force. Leaves that had been scattered floated back to their respective branches. Dirt and natural debris were carried on invisible winds back to the surfaces from which they'd been blasted or shaken. It was as if the impact or explosion and its disastrous effects were being reversed, as if the hands of time were being rewound. But the moon wasn't visibly affected by this phenomenon. Its position in the night sky was not altered in accordance with the reversal of the destruction. Its light was not recalled and replaced by the light of the sun. In what couldn't have been more than a minute, the woods beyond Oscar's home were restored to the state they'd been earlier in the day, prior to the impact by the strange and unwitnessed celestial object. When nothing else of note appeared outside, I turned back to Oscar and instantly recoiled away from him. His skin was incredibly pale, and his eyes, though open, were fixed on something that I instantly knew to be beyond normal sight, some image or vision that to me would be unseeable. His expression had not changed much from the grimly calm face he'd had moments before, but there was an almost imperceptible exaggeration of his bleak features, like a parent being told that not only had their child misbehaved at school, but that they'd also have to come pick up the troublesome student in the middle of the day. Finally, regaining my voice, unaware that I'd lost it in my shock, I called out to Oscar, asking what exactly he was seeing. Unsurprisingly, he didn't respond, but kept staring at something beyond the bounds of normal sight. I wanted to shake him, snap him out of his dark fixation, but I didn't know what effects sudden movement might have on his body, which had suffered a severe wound only moments before. And still, the pocket watch's hands ticked on, unsettlingly audible. When the ticking abruptly stopped, the atmosphere simultaneously felt as if the air had been instantly recycled, removed and replaced in only a second. But a horribly tangible second nonetheless. I felt my breath snatched away from me, and for the briefest moment I experienced total respiratory absence, a terrifying breathlessness that I wouldn't wish upon anyone. Additionally, coinciding with this bizarre moment was the return of color to Oscar's face and the relaxation of his severe expression. His eyes blinked and his chest heaved, as if his lungs were taking in a breath for the first time in a while. The blood from his chest wound resumed its flow down his shirt, eventually reaching and staining the hideous rug beneath him. Oscar's hands went to his chest in an attempt to stop the bleeding, but the blood kept pouring between his fingers, pushing through the cracks and streaming down his body as if flowing from a geyser. He made a noise that sounded more bestial than human, a croak that lacked any vocal indications of intellectual articulation, the death noise of an animal. Shortly after this terrible utterance, he did speak, but his words were no less bleak and disconcerting than that feral croak, and sounded as if they'd been spoken from across a distance far greater than the few feet that separated us. I went there. I went beyond time into the domain of the uncreated. Oh my God. God, you wouldn't believe it. It's all there. God, the devil, and every monstrous thing in between. As I stood among it all, I saw time racing towards me. Time, a pitifully slow thing. Oh man, it's just pure potential, that place. Endless, untouched clay. A blank and borderless canvas and the unfertilized ovum of the yet-to-be cosmos. And then it spat me out. Rejected something that was formed and defined. Before I could obtain any supreme truths, I'm speeding to you now, racing back a long time, that dogged pursuer. It wouldn't let me go. I'm hurtling towards the earth, back to the present, but I'm going too fast. I can't see my body, I can't control my trajectory. Outside, before a sentence finished, something struck the earth. The basement was thrown into chaos as the ground trembled in the impact. Video game cases and snack wrappers flew across the room. I fell onto the rug and clung there, feeling like the world had been turned upside down. After a few moments, when the house finally settled, I tentatively pushed myself up and looked at Oscar. His body was lying on the floor, covered in snack wrappers and dust. In a short-lived moment of excitement, I noticed that his chest wound had been sealed, as if time had been rewound back to before he had cut himself. Even his clothing was free of bloodstains, as was the rug. Oddly, not only had the bloodstains vanished from the rug, but the spots where they'd been were also free of the stains and damaged of prolonged use, as if the very threads had been replaced or restored to a former time. The pocket watch was in his hand, but seeing this drained the excitement out of my body. Dread reared itself again in my heart. The pocket watch was clutched in what was undeniably the grip of a dead man. Oscar's eyes, still fixed towards a single point, had lost their intrinsic luster, had become truly unaware of the immediate environment. The reversal of events. Oscar had died. His soul, I realized with a grim certainty, had been the meteoric object. It explained why there had been nothing to see when we examined the crater earlier in the day. The soul, the human spirit, whatever it's made of, is evidently invisible to the naked eye, or is so feebly phantasmal that it had wholly disintegrated upon impact. I closed my friend's eyes, pried the pocket watch from his hand, and carried him upstairs. I set his body on a chair in the living room and called the police, hoping they'd actually respond this time, since they had yet to come investigate the meteor. I told 911 that he'd had a heart attack, and made no mention of the pocket watch nor his cross-cosmic, time-surmounted journey. And that is it for the night, boys and girls. Thank you so much for joining me, and as always, sweet nightmares.